You lower the bucket slowly, the iron handle digging into your palms until the skin burns. The wooden corridor is so narrow you can feel the walls breathing back at you, damp with mildew, swollen from months of humidity. The floor groans with every step, streaked with footprints that will be yours to erase before the next soldier arrives. You kneel, knees pressing into splintered boards, and press the rag against the stain. The cloth is stiff from yesterday's wash, its edges frayed, but you grind it across the wood until the water darkens. The air chokes you with its mixture: sharp disinfectant, boiled rice, sweat, and smoke, layered until every breath tastes like rot. No matter how deep you inhale, the smell clings to your throat, an invisible hand squeezing tight. Somewhere behind the thin wooden doors, laughter crashes into the hallway, loud and careless. Boots scuff the floor, and a soldier emerges, his uniform half-buttoned, his cheeks flushed from liquor. He spits onto the boards you just cleaned, his gaze sliding over you as if you are a shadow, then disappears into the haze of lantern light. You lean forward quickly, rag ready, scrubbing away the trace before it spreads. You move down the corridor, bucket sloshing at your side. The lantern above flickers, stretching your shadow long across the walls. From one room comes the sound of boots hitting the floor. From another, a muffled cry that cuts off too quickly. You force your ears to dull, humming under your breath to drown out the noise, though the tune falters as your throat tightens. You are not supposed to make sound, not supposed to exist beyond your hands and the stains they erase. But the silence crushes harder than the noise. Another door creaks. This time no laughter spills out, only silence, heavy and raw. You slip inside before the next man arrives. The room reeks of bodies, of sweat mixed with vinegar water poured too hastily across the bed. The sheets are tangled ropes, damp and stained, the pillow shoved against the wall. A girl sits at the edge of the mattress. She is motionless, her shoulders folded inward, her hair glued to her cheeks. Her eyes lock onto yours, unblinking, wide in a way that makes you forget how to breathe. She is no older than your daughters were when the soldiers came to your village. You crouch low, placing the bucket beside you, the rag trembling in your hand. She whispers something, but the words collapse before reaching your ears. Her lips move again, slower, as if each syllable costs her the last of her strength. You reach forward, ready to wipe the twisted sheets clean, when her fingers snap around your wrist. Her grip is cold and desperate, holding you there in the silence that swallows both of you whole. Comfort stations were not accidents of war. They were deliberate, constructed by order, and maintained with precision, stretching across every territory the Japanese military occupied. From the outside, they resembled ordinary inns or barracks, doors lined in rows, lanterns glowing at dusk. On paper, they were described as places to regulate soldiers, to prevent disorder, to preserve discipline. Inside, they became something else entirely, an industry that consumed women by the tens of thousands and required an invisible chain of workers to keep it running. The women who cleaned these spaces rarely appear in records, yet without them, the cycle could not have continued. Beds had to be stripped after each visit. Floors had to be washed before stains hardened. Buckets of water, cloths, soap, and disinfectant were requisitioned alongside food and ammunition. Orders were sent not only for soldiers and supplies, but also for the staff who maintained the brothels. In some towns, local women were pulled from their villages and assigned to cleaning duty, told it was war service, given no chance to refuse. The system was vast, and its reach difficult to measure. Historians estimate that stations existed in nearly every garrison town, from China to Burma to the Pacific Islands. Some were small, A handful of rooms run with crude efficiency. Others were sprawling compounds, housing hundreds of women and processing soldiers in endless rotations. The cleaner existed at the bottom of this hierarchy, trapped in a place that demanded her labor while erasing her face. The Japanese command left behind ledgers and reports, some coldly noting the number of men processed in a single evening. In rare fragments of testimony, survivors remembered older women moving quietly through the halls, mopping floors, carrying buckets. They were not guards. They were not soldiers. They were the shadows between doors. Yet their silence spoke volumes about how the system endured. Scholars still argue whether these stations were primarily tools of discipline, meant to curb violence against civilians, or a profitable enterprise for the army itself. Whatever the motive, they depended on more than soldiers and victims. They depended on the hands that scrubbed away the traces, leaving behind rooms that looked clean, but never were. Her days began before sunrise, when the station was at its quietest. Though quiet never meant peace. She fetched water before the soldiers stirred, balancing buckets across her shoulders, while the mist still clung to the fields. By the time the first boots hit the corridor, she was already bent to the floor, rag in hand, working through the stains left from the night before. Cleaning was not occasional upkeep. It was a cycle without pause, as relentless as the footsteps that filled the halls. Rooms were reset in frantic rhythm, sheets stripped, floors scrubbed, pillows shaken, bowls collected, all before the next man stepped through the door. The turnover was constant. In some stations, women were forced to serve 15 soldiers a day, in larger garrisons many times more. That pace meant the cleaner's labor could never slow. One door closed, another opened, and she was already there, wiping, rinsing, hauling, resetting, trying to stay one step ahead of the rotation. Soap was precious, often gone before the week ended. When supplies ran out, she mixed ashes with water to scour the wood, the grain eating at her fingers until they cracked and bled. Lime was sometimes used, its sharp burn leaving her skin raw. The smell clung to her body, acrid and sour, seeping into her clothes, no matter how often she rinsed them. Every task etched marks onto her hands, the story of her days written in fissures across her skin. What she cleaned was never just dirt. The rag soaked up blood, sweat, spit, and more, each cloth carrying away what the walls were forced to witness. Sheets were heavy with the weight of use, and carrying them to the wash was a burden that bent her back until it ached. She moved quickly, not because she wanted to, but because delay risked punishment. The soldiers did not tolerate waiting. The officers did not tolerate stains. To outsiders, her role might have seemed ordinary. Cleaning is a task found in every household, but here it was different. Here it became part of a machine that demanded silence, a cycle where labour erased evidence only long enough to make room for more. She could not refuse. She could not slow. The work consumed every hour, and still it was never enough. The first thing anyone noticed upon entering a comfort station was the smell. It was everywhere, clinging to walls, clothes, and hair, a mixture of sweat, boiled rice, disinfectant, and smoke. For the cleaner, it became the air she breathed each day, a constant haze that coated her lungs. She carried it with her beyond the station's walls, so that even in the fields or at the river, she could still taste vinegar and carbolic acid at the back of her throat. There was no escape. Her work made the odours sharper. Each bucket she carried released a sour cloud of disinfectant, stinging her eyes until tears blurred her vision. Floors slick with vinegar water left her skin raw. Her hands cracked and white from the chemicals. She tucked sprigs of bitter herbs into the fold of her apron, pressing them to her nose to mask the sting. But the illusion lasted only a moment, before the station smell pressed back. heavier than before. Disease haunted the place, not as rumour, but as fact. Soldiers worried less about their cruelty than about infections that could spread through the ranks. Inspections were ordered, sanitation protocols dictated, and cleaning became part of a theatre, meant to suggest order in a place built on violation. Buckets of water poured across boards, sheets boiled in vats, rags burned when stains refused to fade. The smell of bleach and smoke became symbols of discipline, though everyone knew disease spread anyway. Some who survived remembered the smell most vividly. Long after the war, women spoke of vinegar sharp enough to burn the skin, of sheets that never lost the odour of sweat, no matter how much they were scrubbed. Even the cleaner's body became a vessel of it, her hair heavy with fumes, her skin carrying the sting. She lived inside a cloud that no bath could wash away. The irony was bitter. For all the emphasis on cleanliness, the rooms never felt clean. The floors glistened wet, the sheets looked white, the air burned with chemicals. But beneath it lingered the truth. What she scrubbed was not dirt, but the trace of what men demanded, and what women endured. The smell told the story, and the smell never left. The cleaner's duties often reached beyond buckets and cloths. At mealtimes she carried trays through the corridors, bowls of thin rice gruel, pickled vegetables, or soup so watery it tasted more of salt than nourishment. The soldiers devoured their portions quickly, chopsticks clattering against the rim, voices loud with crude jokes. Their hunger was noisy. By contrast, the women ate in silence. They bent their heads low, hands shaking as they lifted food to their lips. Every swallow was careful, as though the act itself risked attention they could not afford. Rations shrank as the war dragged on. Japan's stretched supply lines meant food was scarce, and comfort stations felt the strain. Soldiers often complained, but the women and workers suffered more. Malnutrition hollowed faces and thinned limbs. The cleaner herself felt her strength wane, but her labour never slowed. She still hauled buckets, still bent to the floors, still carried trays heavier than her weakened arms could bear. Hunger became another weight pressing down, unrelenting. Testimonies remembered scraps hidden like treasures. A piece of fish tucked into a sleeve, a grain cake saved for later, crumbled into dry hands behind closed doors. Some survivors recalled cleaners who looked away, who slipped an extra mouthful when officers were not watching. These gestures were small, almost invisible, but they carried a force larger than their size. In a place where voices were stolen, food became a language of its own, yet the meals themselves revealed the hierarchy as clearly as the uniforms did. Soldiers were served first, their bowls filled even when supplies dwindled. The women received what remained, often barely enough to keep them standing. Cleaners ate last, scavenging leftovers, or chewing on rice, hardened at the bottom of pots. It was survival, but only just. Food was meant to sustain, but here it became another tool of silence. Conversations were muted, heads lowered, chopsticks moving without sound. Even in hunger, no one dared linger over their bowl. Meals were not pauses in the day, but extensions of it, reminders of power drawn in lines as sharp as any blade. The cleaner walked those lines with every tray she carried, knowing which hunger would always matter least. Sound was impossible to escape inside the station. The walls were thin, the ceilings low, every voice carrying like a current through water. The cleaner heard them all. Soldiers laughing too loudly, their words slurred with alcohol, boots stomping as they jostled in the hallway. Doors creaked open and slammed shut again, the rhythm almost mechanical. From behind those doors came noises that cut deeper. Short cries muffled by pillows, whimpers that climbed into screams before dropping into silence. Sometimes there was nothing at all, and the absence was worse. She tried to shut her ears, to make her body deaf while her hands continued to scrub. But sound had a way of forcing itself in. Humming became her defense. A rough tune, carried low in her throat, filled the space just enough to drown out what she could not bear. Some women later remembered that humming, not as music, but as a fragile barrier, the one reminder that a human voice still lived in the corridor. The soldiers ignored it. To them, she was a shadow with a bucket, too small to register. They shouted, laughed, cursed, without pause. Their voices filled the air with a sense of triumph, as if the world beyond the station had already been conquered. Yet the cleaner knew that in every room behind their noise, another story was unfolding. A story pressed into whispers and tears. Rumours sometimes travelled on sound alone. She overheard names called in the night, women summoned and never seen again. Whispers spread that one had tried to flee, that another had fallen ill and been taken away. No official words were given, only the fragments caught in passing. These fragments became truth, because in a place built on silence, even the smallest voice echoed louder than orders written on paper. Historians today struggle to measure how much the surrounding communities knew about stations like these. Some argue that the cries and the laughter made the reality impossible to ignore. Others suggest the sounds blurred into the noise of war, mistaken for drills, celebrations, or punishment. For the cleaner, there was no such uncertainty. Every cry pressed itself into her memory. Every silence carved another mark she would carry long after her hands had put down the rag. Once a week, the rhythm of the station shifted. Soldiers lined the halls, while the women were summoned for medical inspections. The cleaner's work began hours earlier, hauling buckets of disinfectant, scrubbing benches until the wood splintered, pouring vinegar water into bowls meant to hold instruments. By the time the officers arrived, the corridors stank of carbolic acid, sharp enough to sting eyes and peel skin. The cleaner's hands burned from it. Her palms cracked white, but no one noticed. She was expected to move in silence, arranging everything before the parade of bodies began. The inspections were not quiet. Soldiers smoked as they waited, making crude jokes that filled the air with smoke and laughter. Inside the room, the women stood still, stripped bare under lantern light, their faces fixed, as if carved from stone. Military doctors moved through them with gloves, examining, recording, sometimes lecturing. The cleaner moved along the edges, gathering discarded cloths, wiping surfaces slick with chemicals, carrying waste away in buckets. She was not part of the ritual, but she was trapped inside it, her labour tying her to every moment. What was called sanitation never brought safety. Disease still spread quickly, infecting soldiers and women alike. The inspections became more about maintaining the image of control than preserving health. Reports boasted of order and cleanliness, yet testimonies decades later revealed the truth. Women left the rooms trembling, ashamed, while soldiers walked out laughing. For the cleaner, the contrast was searing. She was left to scrub benches streaked with disinfectant, knowing the shame was not something water could wash away. Small details stayed with her. The metallic clink of instruments hitting bowls, the sharp hiss when vinegar splashed onto raw skin, the way the soldiers' boots tapped impatiently as though waiting for a feast. She learned to keep her head low, her eyes fixed on her bucket, but her ears absorbed everything. Even her silence became part of the inspection, another reminder that her place was to witness without speaking. Decades later, arguments would arise over whether these inspections were truly about health or merely another form of control. But for the cleaner in that moment, there was no debate. She knew what she saw. The inspections humiliated, degraded, and carved scars deeper than illness ever could. Her job was to erase the physical traces. The rest remained, long after the lanterns dimmed. In a place built on silence, whispers travelled like contraband. They slipped between doors, carried down corridors, caught in the pauses between footsteps. The cleaner heard them as she worked, bending over buckets, rinsing sheets, or sweeping ashes into corners. She never repeated what she heard, but the fragments lodged in her memory. A girl had been taken away during the night. Another had collapsed and not returned. Someone had tried to run and was caught before she reached the gates. No announcements were made. The absences spoke for themselves. The station was never still. Women were transferred between locations like cargo, recorded in ledgers that tallied bodies alongside soap and rice. One day the cleaner scrubbed the bedding of a woman she recognized by her voice, and the next day that voice was gone. A new face would appear in her place. The cycle uninterrupted. The work unchanged. She learned not to grow familiar with anyone, yet the silence left behind weighed heavier than the stains she scrubbed away. Small details sharpened the rumours. A room left untouched for days. The bed neatly made but never used. An officer's order to burn bedding rather than wash it. A name whispered in passing, repeated with urgency, then falling silent again. These details became signals of loss, though no one dared confirm it aloud. For the women inside, the whispers were warnings. For the cleaner, they became markers of time, grim milestones, counted not in days, but in disappearances. Years later, historians would argue about numbers, about how many were forced into the system, and how many disappeared within it. The records were destroyed, burned, as the empire collapsed, leaving behind only fragments and testimonies. But for those inside the walls, the truth was not abstract. It lived in the missing faces, the empty rooms, the sudden silences that followed hushed words. The cleaner understood that silence could be more dangerous than sound. The laughter of soldiers was sharp, the cries of women unbearable. But the moments when the station seemed to hold its breath, that was when fear pressed hardest against her chest. Whispers carried just enough truth to keep hope alive, but never enough to protect anyone. They drifted like smoke, impossible to catch, vanishing before anyone dared speak them aloud. By 1944, the station itself seemed to weaken. Supplies that once arrived in steady shipments now trickled in, late or incomplete. Soap disappeared first, then clean cloth. Then even the buckets that held water rusted until their handles snapped. The cleaner adapted as she always had, finding new ways to do old work. Ashes mixed with water became her scrub, sharp and grey. When even ashes were scarce, she used sand, grinding it into the wood until her fingers bled. The work did not lessen. It grew harder, meaner, more desperate with every month of retreat. The soldiers changed too. They grew thinner as rations shrank, their faces hollowed, their tempers quick to snap. Hunger sharpened every command, every strike of a boot against the floorboards. Their uniforms sagged with wear, but their authority weighed heavier than ever. For the women inside, the burden multiplied. Exhaustion carved into their bodies, and the cleaner saw them falter more often, collapsing onto sheets she would later strip away. She worked faster, not out of choice, but necessity. For delays brought violence, scarcity brought fire. When linen could no longer be washed, officers ordered it burned. In courtyards, piles of bedding were set alight, smoke rising in dark plumes that hung above the compound. The cleaner stood among the ashes afterward, sweeping black dust into piles with the same rag she used on the floors. The smell of charred cloth clung to her hair. Another odour layered onto the station's endless stench. Rumours of defeat spread through whispers just as quickly as smoke. Soldiers muttered of losses in the Pacific, of retreating armies, of cities bombed into rubble. Some grew reckless, their fear disguised as cruelty. Others drank more, clinging to denial. The station reflected this unravelling. Order cracked, but chaos offered no relief. Women still served, cleaners still scrubbed. The cycle unbroken, even as the empire crumbled. Later debates would ask whether retreat loosened the system, whether collapsing supply lines allowed moments of reprieve. But the memories of those inside tell another story. Hunger, filth, and violence pressed closer with every passing day. For the cleaner, the war's turning did not mean release. It meant carrying heavier buckets with weaker arms, scrubbing harder with fewer tools, listening to despair deepen in every room. Defeat outside the gates only made survival inside more unbearable. When the war ended, the stations collapsed almost overnight. Soldiers abandoned their posts, officers fled, and the buildings were left behind like husks. The cleaner put down her bucket one morning and did not return to pick it up. No one gave her orders, but no one gave her freedom either. She simply walked away, back into a world that pretended nothing had happened, carrying with her the smell of vinegar, smoke, and sweat that clung to her skin long after the rooms were emptied. Some women remained behind, too ill to move, too broken to flee. The cleaner remembered them most. She saw them huddled in corners of rooms once filled with soldiers' laughter, now eerily quiet. Sheets hung limp, no longer replaced, the stains unwashed. The silence was not relief. It was heavier, pressing down on the walls, until the entire station felt like a tomb. The work that had defined her days was gone, but the memory of it remained etched into her muscles. Her hands still twitched as if gripping a rag, her back still bent under invisible buckets. In trials held after the war, testimonies were gathered from survivors, soldiers, and officers. The cleaner's name was rarely recorded. On rare occasions, one would appear at the edges of testimony, a shadow in the background, a woman who carried water, an old figure with a rag, a quiet witness who scrubbed stains that others refused to see. She was not asked to speak. Her silence made her invisible, even to history. The Japanese government denied the system for decades, erasing ledgers, discarding records, dismissing memories as rumor. Only later, when survivors broke through the silence, did fragments of her labor surface again. Still, debate lingers. Was she a victim, trapped into service without escape, or a bystander who kept the cycle alive? The truth lies between categories, as tangled as the sheets she once carried. She was neither soldier nor prisoner, yet she lived bound to both. What endures is absence. No statues were raised for her. No records preserved her name. She returned to her village, perhaps, or disappeared into a city where no one asked about her past. Her legacy is not carved in stone, but carried in the memories of those who caught glimpses of her shadow. The woman with the bucket, who erased what others refused to acknowledge. History moved on. She remained in its silence. Step back, and the comfort station fades into dust, its walls collapsing, its doors falling silent. What remains is not the building, but the weight of what was carried inside. The cleaner left no diary, no testimony of her own, only the fragments of others who remembered a shadow with a bucket moving through halls that smelled of vinegar and despair. Her story was not written for her. It survives only in absence, in the silence that history so often gives to those at the bottom. To speak of war is to list generals, battles, treaties, and victories. Yet between those grand words lived the ordinary hands that scrubbed, hauled, and erased. The cleaner was one of them, unseen yet essential, trapped in a system that used her labor to make horror look orderly. Her survival did not bring recognition. It brought memory she could never shake. The smell in her lungs, the sounds in her ears, the stains etched into her skin. We inherit her silence. We walk streets where her name was never spoken, read textbooks that skip over her work, and live in a world that still struggles to acknowledge what those stations truly were. But forgetting is its own kind of violence. Remembering her means remembering the weight of the ordinary, the way survival often looked like scrubbing floors in the dark, while others decided who lived and who vanished. No monuments rise for women like her. Their legacy lingers in the echoes, in the stains that water could not wash away. To tell her story now is to pull her out of shadow, to say her labor mattered, Her silence mattered. Her witness mattered. The question left for us is simple. Do we let her vanish again? Or do we finally see her for what she was? Not a name in a ledger, but a life bound to history's cruelest machinery, carried on in silence, waiting to be remembered.